The laugh broke out of Maeve Linwood before she could close her teeth on it, and it rang the length of the silent dining hall like a dropped spoon. She had not meant to do it. She had bowed her head with the rest of them, folded her chapped hands in her lap, and waited through the longest dinner grace she had ever sat under. The master of the house spoke each word as though he were laying heavy stones on a fresh grave. And the laugh might have stayed buried if the old hound under the table had not chosen that exact instant of held breath to sneeze with such violence that the silver platters rang on the sideboard. A single red apple rolled off its pyramid and bounced twice across the polished wood before coming to rest against the base of an empty wine glass that nobody had filled. Nobody moved. Nobody so much as breathed, and it was the total lack of breathing that did it. The total solemnity of 11 grown people pretending a dog had not sneezed and an apple had not bounced struck Maeve as the funniest thing she had witnessed in the whole of her 25 years. The laugh came up out of her like water out of a cracked dam. She clapped her hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The sound had already gone up to the high ceiling and come back down again. Every face at the long table turned toward her, white and shocked, as if she had stood on her chair and sung a loud song. At the head of the table, Jonathan Cross lowered his pale hands from his face. He looked down the length of the frozen wood straight at her. Maeve had been told in the carriage by the woman at the employment agency that the master had not smiled in 7 years. She had taken it for an exaggeration, polished smooth by repetition, but meeting his eyes now, she believed it completely. His eyes were a striking silver color, and they were not cruel, which somehow made them feel worse. They were the eyes of a man who had simply forgotten how to use his own face. He was young to look so old, perhaps 32 years of age. His snow-white hair was tied back neatly, contrasting sharply with his dark velvet coat, and his skin was as pale as the winter drifts outside the window. He sat perfectly still, not moving a single muscle, watching her with a cold intensity that made the room feel even colder than it already was. "Forgive me," Maeve managed to say. Her voice came out much smaller than she liked. "The dog startled me." The giant hound, hearing himself discussed, thumped his thick tail once against the floorboards. To Maeve's left, a small girl in a plain gray dress was staring at her with a strange expression. Lily Cross was 8 years old and sat very straight in her chair. Her small hands were folded in her lap exactly as Maeve's had been, and her pale face held something that flickered and vanished before Maeve could name it. "You will find, Miss Linwood, that we do not laugh at the Hearthwood estate," said a dry voice from the foot of the table. The speaker was Helen Albright, an elderly woman in deep black silk, her white hair dressed without a single ornament. She did not raise her voice, but the whole room seemed to tune itself to her displeasure. Maeve nodded quietly, saying she understood. The white-haired master said nothing at all as he picked up his spoon, signaling that the silent meal could finally begin. The dinner that followed was the strangest Maeve had ever eaten in her life. 11 people, a quiet child, a large dog, and an empty place laid in full at Jonathan's right hand. A silver plate, a crystal glass, and a folded napkin pressed into the shape of a white flower sat there untouched. Nobody looked at it yet. The servant served it as though someone sat there ladling hot soup into a bowl that was carried away completely untasted at the end of the course. Maeve watched the steam rise off that abandoned soup and curl into nothing. She felt her laughter vanish entirely, replaced by a cold weight in her chest. She had walked into this house because she had nowhere else to walk, and that was the plain truth. 3 months ago, her father's heart had stopped over his breakfast eggs, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of debt. Her older sister had married a poor man who could not afford to house an extra mouth, leaving Maeve to survive on her own. She had been educated to pour tea-sketch old buildings and speak French, which meant she had exactly one marketable quality: she could teach children. So she had forced herself to laugh at the auction laugh at the agency and laugh in the carriage because she had learned that a woman who laughs is a woman. Nobody pities, and pity was the one thing she could not survive. Laughter was her solid armor against the world, but she had not expected to need it so desperately before the soup was even cleared. That night, a quiet servant gave her a small candle and showed her to a narrow bedroom in the cold north wing of the house. Maeve sat on the edge of the mattress in her traveling dress and listened to the great house creak and settle around her like thick ice on a mountain pond. Somewhere below, a clock struck 11 times into the dark. There were no voices, no music, and no closing doors. She blew out her candle and found that her face actually ached from the effort of her forced smiles. The schoolroom faced north and had not seen a fire lit before noon in living memory. "The master does not hold with indulgence in the nursery," said Mr. Benson, the butler, when Maeve asked about wood for the hearth. Mr. Benson was a tall, gray, perfectly correct man who appeared to have been carved from the same cold stone as the estate walls. He adjusted his white cuffs and looked down his nose at her, completely unmoved by her request for a warm room. "Miss Lily has her constitution to consider," Maeve said, pointing to the child's small reddened hands. "I should think a fire might be considered an aid to a child's health rather than a threat to it. But perhaps the philosophy is different in these cold mountains." Mr. Benson looked at her as though a piece of furniture had spoken to him. He promised to inquire with the housekeeper, but his tone made it perfectly clear that the room would remain freezing for the rest of the day. When the butler left, Maeve crouched down in front of Lily, who was standing by the frosted window in her gray dress. The little girl held a wooden slate against her chest like a protective shield, her gray eyes watchful and completely unreadable. "Well," Maeve said cheerfully, trying to catch her eye, "we are both quite new here, you and I." Lily looked at her coldly and said she was not new, but rather the teacher who had just arrived. "I have had 4 teachers already," Lily whispered, her voice completely flat and devoid of any childish warmth. "Miss Pym cried after 2 weeks. Miss Dove did not cry, but she left in the middle of the night and did not say goodbye to anyone. Miss Acton said this grand house was haunted by spirits, and my grandmother dismissed her for being rude. The last one left before I could even remember her name." She delivered this information like a clerk reading a business ledger. "You laughed at the dinner table last night." Lily continued, looking directly into Maeve's eyes. "Grandmother will surely dismiss you too before the week ends. I should not become attached to you." Maeve felt something turn over in her chest at those words. It was a sharp, unwelcome recognition, like meeting her own past face in a strange mirror. She knew that guarded voice because she had used it herself when her father died. It was the voice of a person who had decided that wanting things was a luxury they could not afford, and Lily had decided it far too young. "That seems very sensible," Maeve said softly. "And yet, I find I have already become rather attached to you, so I am afraid our plan is completely spoiled." Lily stared at her in surprise, stating that it was impossible to care for someone after only one single day of knowing them. "I am incredibly impulsive," Maeve explained as she stood up and brushed the dust off her dark skirts. "It is one of my absolute worst faults, and my mother despaired of it constantly. Now Mr. Benson has denied us a warm fire, your grandmother has denied us laughter, and this room is the temperature of a frozen river. Therefore, we shall have an immediate lesson in geography, and the lesson is simple." The little girl watched her closely, her posture loosening just a fraction. "We are going to find the absolute warmest room in this entire house," Maeve declared with a bright smile. "And we are going to occupy it like travelers finding a warm camp." A long silence stretched between them in the cold room. Then, in a very small voice, as if she were confessing to a terrible crime, Lily whispered that the kitchen was always hot. Maeve clapped her hands and led the way down the corridor. The kitchen was a vast, bright room dominated by a massive iron stove that threw off a wonderful heat. Mrs. Gable, the cook, was a wide, warm woman who turned out to be the single source of comfort in the entire establishment. She did not mind their intrusion at all, immediately pressing a hot, sweet biscuit into Lily's small hands. The child sat down on a low wooden stool by the great range, her leather boots actually beginning to steam from the welcome warmth. Her ladyship's daughter was the mistress here. Mrs. Gable murmured to Maeve, keeping her voice low while the child ate. Mistress Clara was the loveliest creature you ever saw in your life. You should have seen this grand house back then, miss. It was lit up like a summer fair with music playing in the long gallery, the doors never shut, and her laughter loud enough to wake the birds in the trees. The cook's wide face softened with old memories. 7 years come this winter season she has been gone. Mrs. Gable continued, wiping her hands on her apron. The old grandmother came for the funeral services, and well, she simply never went back to her own home. The doors have been shut tight ever since that terrible night. Maeve asked what had happened, noticing that Lily was pretending to look at her slate while listening with her entire body to the conversation. The cook's eyes flicked toward the silent child before she shook her head. "Not for small ears to hear," she said quietly. "There was thick ice on the mountain lake, and there was a dark night. That is all I will say. But the master was not always a cold statue, miss. He used to be the warmest man in 3 counties, carrying that little one on his broad shoulders, down to see the new lambs in the spring." Maeve looked at Lily, noting the small steaming boots, the half-eaten biscuit, and those careful ledger-keeping eyes. She felt her own armor of forced laughter slip just a little bit, replaced by a fierce determination. She had come to this remote valley to earn her daily bread, knowing a teacher must keep her place. But nobody had carried this lonely child on their shoulders in a very long time. And that thought remained in her mind. "Eat your food," Maeve told the girl gently, and she was rewarded with a very faint twitch at the corner of Lily's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but rather the faint ghost of a rumor of a smile. It was a small beginning, Maeve decided. Yet the strict ritual of dinner did not bend, and on her second night at the table, Maeve learned exactly how much it would cost to test the rules of the house. Lily had spent the afternoon drawing a remarkably good map of an imaginary kingdom, and Maeve wanted to encourage her. Seated in the long silence between the fish course and the main roast, Maeve leaned slightly toward the child and whispered that she had drawn the river beautifully that day. It seemed a monstrous thing that a young child should sit through an hour of food with no one permitted to speak a kind word to her. The grandmother's silver fork came down against her porcelain plate with a sharp click that silenced the entire room instantly. "We do not converse during our meals, Miss Linwood," the old woman said without looking up from her food. "The dinner hour is reserved for quiet reflection." Maeve took a breath and asked what they were supposed to reflect upon, knowing the moment the words left her mouth that it was the wrong question. The white-haired master at the head of the table went completely still over his untouched glass of wine. Mr. Benson, standing directly behind the grandmother's chair, closed his eyes briefly as if braced for a heavy blow. "Upon those who are no longer at this table to converse with us," Helen Albright said coldly. "Some families choose to remember their dead Miss Linwood. Perhaps in your hometown, people do things quite differently." There it sat between them, the empty place at Jonathan's right hand, complete with its clean plate and folded white napkin. The entire frozen architecture of the house seemed to rest its massive weight on that one untouched setting. Maeve looked at the steam rising off the hot soup that would be carried away completely untasted. She understood that she was not sitting at a normal dinner table at all, but rather at a permanent graveside. Every single meal in this house was a funeral service that had never been allowed to come to an end. "I beg your pardon," Maeve said quietly, keeping her eyes down. "I meant no disrespect to anyone, living or otherwise." The master said nothing during the rest of the meal, but once before the dessert was served, Maeve felt his eyes on her down the length of the candlelit table. When she lifted her own eyes to meet his, Jonathan did not look away as quickly as a man usually should. She saw in his silver eyes something far more dangerous than anger. He looked at her the way a man trapped in a dark room looks at an open window, as though he had forgotten such a thing existed, and could not decide if the fresh air was a mercy or a torment. Afterward, on the narrow back staircase, Mrs. Gable caught her by the sleeve of her dress. "You must mind your words around her ladyship, miss," the cook whispered in a worried voice. "3 teachers have already been sent packing, and the agency is nearly empty. There is talk that the master will give up the entire estate after the winter holidays and send Miss Lily away to her grandmother's people in the south." The cook's face creased with genuine worry as she pressed Maeve's hand. "This is the 7th winter since the tragedy," she murmured. "The old grandmother has it fixed in her mind that 7 is the year to settle everything permanently. The child will be sent away to a cold school, the house will be shut up, and the master will never marry again. If anything is to be done for them, miss, it must be done now." Maeve climbed the rest of the stairs slowly, her small candle throwing a huge waving shadow against the cold plaster wall. An 8-year-old child was a mere 2 weeks away from being sent to a cold boarding school to become a smaller, quieter version of the woman at the foot of the table. A white-haired master was days away from giving up the last living piece of his past life. She had come here to keep her head down and earn her living, but she heard that safe plan crack straight across like thin ice under a heavy boot. She met Jonathan properly 3 days later, and she met him by breaking the most important rule in the entire house. The grand library was the one room Maeve had been expressly forbidden to enter by the butler on her very first day. Naturally, the library was the exact room Maeve most wanted to enter. When she discovered that Lily's lessons required a large map book and that the only copy lived in the forbidden room, she walked straight to the heavy door. It was slightly open, revealing a real fire burning brightly in the hearth. Jonathan stood at the far window with his back to her, a glass of amber liquid sitting untouched on a table near his elbow. He did not turn around when she entered the room. For a moment, Maeve thought his supernatural hearing had somehow missed her, and she began to back out quietly. "You may take the map book," he said, without moving an inch. "It is the green volume on the second shelf, directly next to the globe. That is what you came for, is it not, Miss Linwood? After you." Maeve froze with her hand on the brass doorknob. "Your Grace has the hearing of a bat," she said honestly. Jonathan turned slowly, the bright firelight catching the stark white of his hair and the hard, pale line of his jaw. "I have the hearing of a man who has lived in a completely silent house for 7 years, he replied. "It comes to the same thing in the end." He looked at her with his silver eyes, and she noticed the faint dark shadows beneath them, the marks of a man who spent his nights walking the empty corridors instead of sleeping. "You are the woman who laughed at my table," he stated. It was not a question, so Maeve did not bother to answer it. She crossed the room to the shelf and found the green book. As she lifted the heavy volume down, she chose to speak because she could never leave a heavy silence alone. "I am also the teacher who has been holding lessons in the kitchen," she said clearly. "The schoolroom is currently colder than the winter mountains outside, but I assumed your Grace had much larger concerns than the temperature of a child's nursery." She heard him exhale slowly. In any other man, it might have been the beginning of a genuine laugh, but in him, it was merely breath. "The schoolroom has no fire, because my wife's mother believes that comfort breeds weakness," Jonathan said, choosing his words with extreme care. "And I have lacked the energy to contradict her wishes these past 7 years. Light the fire tomorrow, Miss Linwood. Take the book and teach the child wherever you can keep her warm," he added. Maeve thanked him sincerely, but because she was Maeve Linwood, she could not stop herself from saying more. "She is a remarkable girl," she told him. "Lily keeps accounts of her own heart the way a businessman keeps a financial ledger, and she has decided never to love anyone in case they leave her." "I find it a very efficient system," Maeve said, looking directly at him. "I used it myself for a whole year after my father died, but I do not recommend it to anyone." Jonathan went completely rigid at her words, his pale face growing cold and flat. "You will not presume to lecture me regarding my own daughter," he said, his silver eyes flashing with warning. "No, Your Grace," Maeve said calmly, tucking the heavy green book under her arm. "I would never dream of doing such a thing." At the door she stopped because the look on his pale face was not pure anger, but rather something raw and flinching like a man struck on an old wound. "I only meant," she added softly, "that someone ought to tell the child she is allowed to live. Good evening." She walked out into the corridor with her heart beating fast, furious with herself the entire way up the stairs. She told herself she would be dismissed before Sunday, and that she could not afford to lose this job. But underneath the worry was a stubborn, quiet thought that had nothing to do with her wages. The white-haired master had flinched, meaning whatever was frozen inside him was not entirely dead. The fire was lit in the schoolroom the very next morning. Mr. Benson supervised the work with an expression of deep disapproval, and the grandmother said absolutely nothing at breakfast, which felt much worse than a loud argument. But the hearth was warm, and Lily sat close to the flames with her small hands spread to the heat, looking up at Maeve with genuine astonishment in her gray eyes. "You asked him for the wood," Lily whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "And he actually did it for you." Maeve opened the green map book and smiled. "I did not ask him for a single thing," she explained. "I merely complained rather loudly in his general vicinity, which is a completely different thing altogether. Now, place your finger on the map." The weeks that followed became a quiet campaign, and Maeve fought the coldness of the house with warmth smuggled in like contraband. She could not change the grand machinery of the estate, the silent dinners, or the empty place setting kept for the dead. But she found in the small schoolroom a kingdom she could rule completely, and she turned lessons into something resembling a game. Geography became a series of imaginary voyages across the deep blue oceans, and arithmetic became a contest with sweet pieces of candy smuggled up from Mrs. Gable's kitchen as prizes. When the heavy winter snows finally came and shut them indoors, Maeve declared the long upper corridor a new territory in need of a proper map setting, Lily to work with her ruler and pencils. The sound of a small child's footsteps running through that hushed house was so unusual that two young housemaids actually came to the foot of the stairs just to see what was wrong. It was on the coldest night of that second week that Maeve discovered the white-haired master kept a quiet vigil of his own in the dark hours of the winter night. She woke past midnight to the sound of soft crying coming from the nursery down the passage. It was the hopeless, muffled weeping of a child who had learned to do it as quietly as possible. Maeve was out of her bed and down the freezing hallway in her shawl before she was fully awake, pushing open the heavy door to the night nursery. She found Lily sitting upright in the dark bed, her small face wet with tears from some terrible dream she could not escape. Kneeling directly at the bedside was Jonathan, his white hair disordered in the dim light. His large, pale hand hovered an inch above his daughter's dark curls, as though he had completely forgotten whether he was permitted to touch his own flesh and blood. He looked up at Maeve in the faint candlelight, and she had never seen a man look so completely undefended. "She cries out in her sleep," he whispered, his voice trembling in the quiet room. "I hear her most nights from the floor below. I have heard her cry out for 7 long years, and I have never once known what to do to comfort her. I come up the stairs, I stand here in the doorway, and then I go back down to my room." Jonathan confessed, his voice cracking on the simple words. I do not know how her mother would have handled this. I only ever know how to stand in the dark doorways. Maeve stepped into the room, her voice gentle as she approached the bed. You must sit on the edge of the mattress, Maeve told him softly. That is the entire secret of the matter. You sit down where the child can easily reach you, and you let her decide whether she wants to come to you. He looked at her as though she had handed him a golden key to a locked door. Slowly, the white-haired master sat down on the edge of the blankets. Lily, half asleep, and not keeping accounts of her heart for once in her careful life, simply turned and buried her face against his broad chest, holding on tightly. Maeve watched Jonathan's pale arms come up around the child, awkward but infinitely careful, as he pressed his face into her hair. Maeve had to grip the wooden doorframe to stop the sudden ache in her own throat. What does she dream of? She asked quietly, after a long moment. Falling. Jonathan replied, his cheek resting against his daughter's head. Always falling through thick ice that will not hold her weight. She was only 1 year old when it happened, so she cannot remember it. Yet she dreams of thin ice every single winter season, he murmured. And I have never spoken a single word to her about that night. I cannot account for it unless an old house can pass its nightmares down to its children like a fever through the walls. Maeve shook her head, explaining that children always breathe in what adults refuse to say. The silence does not protect them, Your Grace, Maeve said. It only leaves them frightened of a dark shape they cannot name. She hesitated for a second before asking what Lily's mother had been like. For a long moment, she thought he would freeze again, stand up and retreat back down to his cold rooms in the center of the house. She was loud, Jonathan said, and the simple word came out broken and amazed, as if he had not allowed himself to reach for the memory in years. She sang in these empty corridors, and she could never keep a secret to save her life. And she laughed at everything, Miss Linwood. She laughed at me most of all, saying I was too solemn. His pale mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, but remembered where a smile came from. I was warm once, he whispered, looking down at the sleeping child in his arms. Hard as it may be for you to believe it now, she made me warm. But when the winter lake took her, I found I could not bear the heat anymore. Every single warm thing in this grand house had her exact shape, Jonathan confessed. So I froze, all of it. I told myself it was out of respect for my grief, but I think now it was only cowardice with better manners. Maeve stepped closer, saying it was simply frightened love, and that the two looked very similar in the dark. He raised his silver eyes to hers across the sleeping child. The small candle guttered between them, and something passed in the warm circle of light that neither of them named, but both of them felt. Good night, Miss Linwood, he said roughly after a long silence. Maeve wished him a quiet night and returned to her cold bed. She lay awake for hours, angry with her own foolishness, but she could not stop seeing the white-haired man's face as he held his daughter. By inches, the house began to thaw over the next week. Lily asked questions that had nothing to do with her books, and she even let out a sudden bark of laughter while sketching the hound. The child immediately covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with alarm as she looked for a punishment that did not come. That was a laugh, Maeve told her solemnly. They are not rationed here. You may have as many as you like today, and there will still be more waiting for you tomorrow. Septerfu. Lily considered this new doctrine carefully. Grandmother says laughing is only for people who have completely forgotten their sorrow, she whispered. Maeve shook her head, explaining that her grandmother was simply very sad, and that sad people often mistake their own high walls for the actual shape of the wide world outside. But you are only 8 years old, Maeve said gently. You are not required to keep her walls. You are required to learn your lessons, love your father, and grow up. And you cannot do that last thing if you remain frozen solid. She saw the master rarely now, but she noticed him during his daily walks on the terrace. Jonathan took a turn about the snowy terrace each afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock alone in all kinds of weather. The schoolroom window happened to overlook that path, and Maeve happened to be standing there more often than chance could account for. He walked like a man pacing a cell, his white hair bare to the falling snow. One afternoon he stopped directly below the glass and looked straight up, catching her there. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Maeve lifted her hand and waved at him cheerfully. He did not wave back, but he stood there a moment longer than necessary before resuming his solitary walk in the deep snow. That night at dinner, Maeve caught him looking at her down the length of the table, and something passed between them in the candlelight that made her neck go warm. She told herself she was being an absolute fool. A penniless teacher mooning over a wealthy master like a young servant girl at a country fair. IDs. The thing that broke the routine was an old silver music box. Maeve found it by accident in an abandoned part of the east wing where the furniture sat under dusty covers. On a marble table sat a small object under a glass dome painted with delicate blue flowers with a tiny silver key remaining in its side. She lifted the glass cover and turned the key just once. The box gave out 3 sweet, thin notes of an old melody before a firm hand came down over hers, stopping the music instantly. Maeve's heart leapt into her throat as she turned expecting the grandmother. But it was Mrs. Halt, the severe housekeeper. The old woman's face was not angry, but entirely stricken with bright tears standing in her eyes. "Please, miss," the housekeeper whispered, her hand trembling over Maeve's, "do not wind it. Nobody winds that box since the tragedy. It belonged to the mistress, and it played at her wedding. The master cannot bear the sound." Maeve apologized quickly, helping to set the glass dome back over the silent box. She realized the whole frozen house was built to hide a deep, unyielding grief that trapped everyone like drowning men under thick ice. They had all agreed to call the silence peace, because the alternative was to feel how cold it truly was. Maeve recognized that feeling because she had done the exact same thing behind her own wall of laughter. She lay awake that night thinking about a white-haired man pacing a frozen terrace and an empty place laid at the table every night for 7 years. Someone, she thought, had to start the music again. A grand carriage came up the driveway unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, which was an incredible event at the quiet estate. It belonged to Lady Crawford, the loudest gossip in the entire mountain valley. She had come to confirm the rumor that the grim master had been seen laughing in the snow with a new teacher. The grandmother was in bed with a severe headache, and the master was out on the grounds, so it fell to Maeve in her one good green dress to receive the guest alone. Lily stood white and rigid at her side as Lady Crawford looked at the child with a bright, pitiless expression. "So this is the poor motherless creature," the guest said, turning a sharp smile on Maeve. "They say the child is quite backward, shut up in this dark tomb with no proper guidance. And you are the teacher everyone is talking about. Tell me the whole story, Miss Linwood. The entire valley is talking." Maeve felt Lily flinch at the word backward, and her own armor came up bright and ready. "The master insists his daughter receive the absolute best education in the county," Maeve said smoothly, pouring the hot tea with perfect calm. "Miss Lily is so far from backward that she corrected my lessons just yesterday. As for the laughing," Maeve continued, looking directly at the woman, "surely you would not want it whispered that the master is incapable of taking pleasure in his own child's company. I am certain a lady of your standing will set the report straight. People do look to you for the absolute truth." Lady Crawford opened her mouth and shut it quickly, realizing she had been handed a story she would now be forced to repeat if she did not wish to seem malicious. She drank her tea quickly and took her leave much sooner than she had originally intended, leaving the room quiet once more. When the carriage left, Maeve turned and found Jonathan standing in the doorway, having heard the entire conversation. He crossed the room, crouched down to his daughter's height, and looked at her. "You corrected her lessons," he said quietly. Lily whispered that she had not meant to be rude to her teacher. "You were correct," Jonathan said firmly, before looking up at Maeve. There was a deep respect in his silver eyes now. "I have had many servants in this house, Miss Linwood, and not one of them ever stood in front of my daughter to take a blow meant for her. I will not forget this." That same evening, Maeve came upon the old grandmother standing alone in the long gallery before a large portrait of the late mistress. The young woman in the painting was laughing, caught by the painter with her dark hair coming down. Helen Albright stood there with one pale hand pressed flat against the frame. Her rigid spine was bowed at last, her head bent in the silent, terrible grief of an old woman who had outlived her only child. In her other hand, she held a small, worn child's mitten made of gray wool kept safe for 7 years. Maeve stepped back quietly into the dark shadows, realized she could not hate her. You cannot hate a deep grief that holds a dead baby's mitten in the dark. You can only fear what it has the power to do to the living. The true conflict came with the arrival of the winter holidays. December deepened, and the snow lay a foot thick over the grand park, but no greenery was cut. "We do not keep the holidays here," Lily informed her during their morning reading. "My mother died during this season, so we have not celebrated since I was a small baby. I do not mind it at all because there is nothing for me to remember or miss." But her pencil had stopped moving on the paper. Maeve looked at the small bent head and made up her mind in an instant. "I think your mother would be very sorry to learn that the only way you remember her is by being completely miserable," she said clearly. "I think a woman who filled this house with music would want you to have a proper holiday." "We could not do that," Lily whispered, her eyes very wide. "Grandmother would be angry." Maeve smiled and told her to leave her grandmother to her, stating that if anyone was to be blamed for a little green branch and a holiday dinner, it should be the new teacher. That was what she was there for. She secretly enlisted the help of Mrs. Gable, who actually wept with joy before producing a hidden supply of cinnamon and dried oranges from her cupboards. The young housemaids fell on the small rebellion like prisoners seeing daylight, hanging green branches of ivy and holly along the back stairs where the grandmother rarely walked. The master noticed the change before anyone else. He came down the stairs one morning to find a large swag of green holly hung over the great fireplace in the hall. He stopped dead on the stone floor, looking at the green leaves for a very long moment without moving a hand. "Who did this?" Jonathan asked. Maeve stepped forward from the shadows of the stairs, her heart beating fast. "I did, your grace," she confessed. "The maids hung it, but the fault is entirely mine. If it offends your sight, I will take it down myself this instant, and we need say no more." Jonathan remained silent for so long that she had begun to reach for the green leaves when he spoke in a low voice. "She used to hang it just there," he whispered, his pale face tightening. "Exactly in that spot. She always tied the branches with a bright red ribbon. You have used red ribbon. Mrs. Gable had it saved in her kitchen," Maeve said softly, not daring to move an inch. Jonathan turned toward her, and his face was terrible, with an old grief that was finally beginning to crack open like ice in the spring. "Leave the green branches, Miss Linwood," he said roughly before walking out. He walked out into the deep snow without his heavy coat, and Maeve watched from the window as he stood in the white park with his back to the house, his shoulders shaking once before he mastered himself. That was the week the white-haired master truly began to change, climbing the nursery stairs often. He would stay for half an hour listening to Lily recite her lessons. When the child made a mistake and looked up in fear, he merely said he could never remember that part, either when he was young. Lily's face opened in pure joy, at being given a piece of her mother's memory that she had never owned. He began to join them on the terrace during their afternoon hour, helping Lily build a large snow fortress against the freezing wind. He had forgotten how to play the machinery of his joy, completely rusted from disuse, but he could carry snow blocks for the ramparts under his daughter's strict direction. Once Maeve caught him squarely in the chest with a handful of loose snow, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then Jonathan laughed. It came out of him rusty and astonished, like a door blown open in a high wind. He put his pale hand to his mouth, as if to check if it were real. Lily flung her arms around his legs, and over the child's head, Jonathan's silver eyes found Maeve's face. What was in them was no longer frozen at all, and Maeve realized with a sinking certainty that she had lost her own heart completely to this white-haired master and his quiet child. The grandmother returned from a visit to a neighboring estate and found her daughter's house filled with green branches. She immediately summoned Maeve to her dark parlor, sitting upright in a chair of black oak. The green holly that had been hung on the mantel now lay on the floor at her feet like a slain thing. "You have been very busy, Miss Linwood," Helen Albright said, her dry voice cracking with cold anger. "You have hung this house with the rubbish of a season that killed my only child. You have taught my granddaughter to shout in these corridors, and you have made my son-in-law into a public spectacle. You think you have brought warmth here," the old woman continued, leaning forward with dark eyes, "but you have brought only forgetting, and I will not have her forgotten. I buried my child, and the least that is owed to her memory is that this house should never learn to be happy without her." Maeve understood the architecture of the place completely now. The grandmother had frozen the estate out of a terrible fear that if they went on living the dead, Queen would be erased forever. "My lady," Maeve said firmly, "nobody is in danger of forgetting her. But you are so busy not forgetting that nobody can actually remember her. There is a music box no one can bear to wind, and a child who cannot recall her mother's face." Maeve said directly, "That is not remembering, my lady. That is being haunted by ghosts, and the dead deserve much better of us." The grandmother went pale, ordering Maeve to leave the estate by morning. Maeve walked out of the room, feeling a hard, bright certainty beneath her fear. She had no savings and nowhere to go, but she knew she was right. The master did not dismiss her that night, though heavy voices were heard behind the library door past the hour of midnight as he argued with the old woman. The next morning, the green branches were still up. Jonathan looked gray and exhausted at breakfast, but he did not send for her. That afternoon, Maeve found Lily holding the forbidden silver music box in the schoolroom, having smuggled it out of the abandoned east wing while the servants were busy with their chores. "I wanted it for the holiday morning," Lily whispered, bracing herself for a scolding. "You said warm things were not rationed here, and I thought my mother's music should not be rationed either. Can we wind it together, Miss Linwood?" Maeve knelt down and folded the child's hands around the silver box, promising they would. Maeve should not have made that promise to the child. The next morning, the old grandmother discovered the glass dome was empty in the east wing, and her angry voice rang down the long corridor. She descended the stairs in a cold fury, holding the empty glass cover out in both her pale hands. "The box is gone," Helen Albright declared, her voice shaking the wooden banisters. "Taken by a child who has been taught that nothing is sacred in this house. This is your doing, Miss Linwood, and it ends today. The child goes to the south within the week, and you will be gone from this house by morning." She ordered the butler to find Lily and bring the box, but the little girl was nowhere to be found. A housemaid came running white with fear to report that Lily's heavy winter boots and thick cloak were missing from their peg, and the small side door leading to the snowy garden stood wide open. Maeve knew instantly where the child had gone. Lily had taken the music box to save it from being locked away forever, running to the small stone summer house at the far end of the garden. The path ran directly along the edge of the mountain lake, where the late mistress had lost her life 7 years ago. Maeve ran out into the blinding blizzard, without a cloak, screaming Lily's name into the freezing wind as she followed the small footprints through the deep snowdrifts. She found the child at the very edge of the white water, having slipped on the icy bank wet and shaking with cold, but holding the silver box safe. Maeve fell on her knees and gathered the child into her arms, weeping with total relief. She looked up and saw Jonathan standing 10 feet away, his face as white as the snow around them. He was not seeing his living daughter safe in the drifts. He was reliving the terrible night from his past. His whole body was locked rigid, with a horror 7 years deep, his silver eyes completely frozen as he looked at them. "Get her inside," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. They carried Lily back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Gable bundled her in warm blankets by the great iron stove. The child was safe, but when Jonathan called Maeve into the grand library later that evening, she knew she had lost. He stood at the dark window with his back to her, his pale face completely closed. "My daughter nearly died today, because you filled her head with dangerous ideas of warmth," he said coldly. "She was never on the ice, Your Grace," Maeve said desperately, stepping into the room. "She only slipped on the snowy bank, and she is perfectly safe now." Jonathan turned around, his silver eyes dark with an old fear. "I let you thaw this house because I had forgotten what comes of warmth here," he said. "Warmth is what walks people out onto the dangerous ice. Miss Linwood," he stated flatly, his voice like stones on a grave. "Joy is the one thing that always gets taken away from us. You will leave this estate in the morning. You will be paid your full wages, but you must go." Maeve stood in the firelight, feeling her heart turn to ash, but she kept her armor on to the very last moment. "As Your Grace wishes," she said quietly. "I will be gone by first light. Only let the child wind her mother's music box tomorrow morning. She has earned the song." She went up to her room and packed her small trunk by candlelight, not sleeping a single wink through the black winter night. Before the sun could rise, a quiet knock came at her door, revealing the old grandmother standing there in her gray robe, looking incredibly old and completely undefended. The old woman held a faded piece of paper and the silver music box in her hands. "I heard what you said to him through the library door last night," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have spent 7 long years teaching this house to be afraid, telling myself it was out of loyalty to my dead child. You said the dead deserve better than to be made into ghosts," Helen Albright said, tears running down her wrinkled face. "My daughter wrote this letter during her last winter season, and I have hidden it away because I could not bear what it asked of us. Take it to my son-in-law." Maeve took the old paper and found Jonathan in the dark library, still standing by the black window. He turned when she entered, his voice dead, as he mentioned the carriage was ready. "You must read this first," Maeve said, handing him the faded letter from his late wife, Clara. Jonathan recognized the handwriting immediately, his pale hands shaking as he unfolded the paper. Maeve watched 7 years of heavy winter ice come completely apart in his pale face as he read the words written by the woman he had lost so long ago, his breath catching in his throat. "Read it aloud to me," Jonathan whispered, dropping into a chair by the cold hearth as his legs gave out beneath him. Maeve knelt down beside him in the gray light of the winter morning and read the last words of the late mistress, her own voice trembling with deep emotion. The letter begged them never to turn the grand house into stone out of grief, stating that Clara had been the happiest creature alive in those rooms. It asked them to light the fires, keep the winter holidays, and win the silver music box until the spring arrived, letting her small daughter laugh. "Tell Jonathan that the worst thing he could do to honor my memory is to stop being warm." Maeve read softly from the faded paper. Find them someone who knows how to laugh in a cold room, and let her into our home. Promise me you will let her in." The library was completely silent when she finished reading. Jonathan lifted his pale face from his hands, his silver eyes wet with real tears. "She knew exactly what I would do," he whispered, looking at Maeve. "I froze this house to honor her, and the freezing was the one thing she hated." He stood up and took Maeve's hands in his own, and she noticed his cold skin was finally growing warm to the touch. "Do not get into that carriage, Eleanor," he begged, using her true nature to call to her. "Stay here with us and teach both of us how to live again." Maeve looked at his wet eyes and realized her own hard armor of forced laughter had fallen away completely. "I must warn you that I am incredibly impulsive," she said through her tears, "and I have been completely in love with you since you missed that snowball by a yard." Jonathan let out a genuine laugh, whole and warm, and pulled her into his broad arms as the morning sun broke through the winter clouds. They were married in the beautiful spring season, when the green bushes bloomed along the terrace, and the old grandmother gave the bride away with a proud smile. The first true thaw had come on that holiday morning when they wound the silver music box together in the great hall surrounded by the entire household. The sweet melody filled every cold corner of the estate, and Lily's loud laughter rang out clearly, signaling that the long winter had finally come to an end. Standing by the tall window of the library, now watching the first green leaves of spring bud on the old oak trees outside, I can feel the quiet warmth of this house settling deep into my bones. The carriage that once threatened to carry me away into a lonely future is gone, and in its place is a life I never permitted myself to dream of during those hard days of debt and forced smiles. I look down at my hands, no longer red from the biting cold of the north wing, and then across the room where Jonathan sits with Lily, their heads bent together over a new book of stories. His white hair catches the bright morning sunlight, and when he looks up to meet my gaze, his silver eyes hold a steady, peaceful light that tells me the long winter of his heart is truly over. We have learned through much sorrow and breaking of old walls that remembering those we have lost does not require us to turn our homes into silent stone monuments. True loyalty to the dead is found in the courage of the living, to let the light back into dark rooms, to plant new flowers where the frost once ruled, and to let a child's laughter ring out without fear of the shadows. The future no longer looks like a narrow path I must walk alone with my armor on, but rather like a wide sunlit valley waiting to be explored by the three of us together. There will be other winter seasons, of course, and other heavy snows that block the mountain roads, but the fires are lit now, and we know how to keep each other warm through the longest night.